Welcome to the Federalist YouTube channel. My name is Tristan Justice, and I'm a staff writer at the Federalist. Joining me today is American author and environmental expert Michael Shellenberger. Michael, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Michael, so you've written a lot about climate change and more recently about the wildfires just raging in Colorado and Oregon right now. You wrote a pretty compelling piece in Forbes magazine outlining why the fires we're seeing right now are so bad as a result of bad land management as opposed to climate change. And let me just read that headline for our listeners can go look it up and read it themselves. Forests that survive megafires prove good management trumps climate change. So Michael, why exactly are the forest fires a result of bad land management as opposed to climate change?
So you have to remember the history here. When my piece was particularly about California, but the history is that when Europeans came in the 19th century, they discovered that there were these small fires that periodically burned the underbrush in California's forests. And they should have let them keep burning because that's actually a part of a healthy forest ecosystem, is to have regular fires. But instead they put them out because they worried that the fires would burn up valuable timber, and they also worried that the fires would end up burning up their homes. And so that practice stayed in place for really a century. And there was a change to how we managed parks in the 60s and 70s, but most of the national forest land, we continued to suppress fires. And so what you have in California and many other states is about 5 times more wood fuel, woody debris on the floors of forests than we had when Europeans came. So climate change is playing a role. It's certainly resulting in a longer fire season. It's resulting in higher temperatures and heat waves. But climate change is neither necessary nor sufficient for the big mega fires, high intensity fires that we're seeing in California today, whereas the accumulation of wood fuel is both necessary and sufficient to those fires. So I think it's important to point that out because you've heard a lot of spin, I think, from both climate activists, climate scientists, a lot of journalists who kind of say, oh, they're both factors, which implies that they're both equal factors when they're clearly not. I wrote a story about a week ago about a well-managed forest called Shaver Lake Forest, where on the map you can see these high intensity fires just cruising along, about to hit that forest. But when they arrived in the well-managed forest, the high intensity fires, which were burning up the tops of the trees, or what's known as the crowns, the fire dropped to the forest floor just as it should have and burned like a prescribed burn, a little bit hotter than a normal prescribed burn. But that's proof that well-managed forests can survive climate change. They can survive mega fires and these high intensity fires.
And how exactly did these fires that were burning across the top of the trees, they just drop below, and how did, what were the mechanics that prevented them from kind of moving back up?
Just the sheer lack of wood fuel. So if they had a normal amount of wood fuel, they're not going to burn that high. They call them ladders. There's so much wood fuel that develops, again, 5 times more wood fuel, that it creates just a big accumulation, just these big stacks of woody debris. Anybody who ever walks through, if you have any awareness of it, if you walk through an old growth ancient forest, it's actually pretty open. You'll have these big trees, but you can walk through them. Whereas if you go to these forests where all this wood fuel is accumulated, it's hard to even walk around. There's just so many tiny trees and also just dead trees and buildup. And so that's what's caused it. You end up having these huge stacks of wood that end up just reaching the tops of the trees, and that's why they burn so intensely.
So while we're talking about fire suppression, I want to talk about some of these numbers that I pulled from ProPublica. Academics believe before Europeans arrived, between 4.4 million and 11.8 million acres were burning in California every year. And that's before Europeans ever arrived. But as you said, with our fire suppression policies in the last few centuries, between 1982 and 1998, agency land managers in the state only burned on average 30,000 acres a year. And it got even worse going into the new millennium. Between 1999 and 2017, it became 13,000. So essentially, if I'm not mistaken, we've just kind of created these giant tinder boxes that naturally just need to burn.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's important to point out that 4 to 12 million acre burn annual number is small fires. So it's not
Okay.
these huge, intense fires. So there is, so it's hard because, you know, a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I think the press corps got educated, but there was a kind of dumb fire bad reaction to California's fires. And it's confusing because there are some forests, the shrubland forests on the coastlands, or what we call the chaparral or oak woodlands, which are really the small trees. This is not the big Sierra Nevada forest. Most people wouldn't even think of it as a forest, but we don't want as many fires there. They have plenty of fires. Fires are a natural part of the shrubland ecosystems, but they have too many fires, and those excess of fires are largely a function of more housing development and more electrical wires, and the failure of California's electrical utilities to maintain the distance between the electrical wires and the vegetation around it. Some of the utilities in California did better than others, but the ones I mean, basically, this is what's connected. The real connection to climate change is that this intense focus on renewables and climate change meant that the utilities were basically, their focus was on integrating increasingly unreliable electricity sources like solar and wind onto the grid, and not on doing the basic work of maintenance. So we don't want fires, more of those fires in the shrubland areas. We do want more of a particular kind of fire in the Sierra Nevadas and the mountain forests. And we also may need some amount of selective harvesting. I tweeted out this morning a Wall Street Journal article which discovered that a town where 10 people died and most of the buildings in a town of about 2,500 people burned up, that town in 2018 had requested permission from the state regulators to be able to thin the forests, or what's called mechanical thinning or forestry, where it just sounds like what it is. I mean, it is what it sounds like. You just use a chainsaw and you go through and you collect the wood. It doesn't always have to be prescribed burns, though many forests do require that amount of fire. Often, in fact, you do them both together. But when we say forest management, what we're referring to is both the prescribed burns and what President Trump famously called raking of the forest floor. I think he got a hard time for it. It wasn't the best way to describe it, but what I think he was pointing to is that if you're not going to be doing prescribed burns in some areas, then you would want to be doing this kind of mechanical thinning of the forests.
So I think the concept of prescribed burns might sound kind of confusing to some people. Could you kind of explain exactly what a prescribed burn is, how they come to be, and what the mechanics are, and how they protect communities from these mega fires we have today?
Yeah, I mean, there's really two kinds of prescribed burns. The first kind is a fire that starts naturally from lightning and that you just allow to burn. You don't suppress it. So that's the first kind. The second kind is when it's deliberately started. There's been some really interesting work with Native American tribes, you know, where they discover that if you basically start a fire in a circle around a tree, it won't actually burn the tree, but it'll burn away from the tree. And that often germinates seed pods. It also fertilizes the forest floor. So in fact, you know, what we know is that, and this is true for agriculture around the world, fire is used for growing crops around the world because you burn off all that biomass and it creates fertilizer. It makes those nutrients accessible to the plants. So again, the prescribed burning is part of a longer tradition that was here before Europeans came, where people were using fires to keep the forest healthy, but then they were also just being started by lightning. But now it's become a bit of an art, and the best practitioners of this art are people in the parks. So Yosemite National Park, which is obviously one of our greatest parks, has been using prescribed burns since the 60s or 70s. And they have guys even that are called smoke modelers, who are basically weather forecasters combined with people that really understand how fire works. Fire is obviously a really complex thing. We don't totally control it. And there's also instances where people do prescribed burns and then they spiral out of control. And so it's a tricky thing to use. It's been controversial in part because the neighboring communities don't want to breathe all that smoke. Often the smoke that blows from prescribed burns or other kinds of burns ends up just sitting in the Central Valley, which is our breadbasket, the agricultural region, because of the temperature inversion. And so that's been a big source of the problems. The EPA and others have prevented prescribed burns for those reasons. But I think that, what really matters here is just that this has not been a place where we've concentrated our efforts. It's something that we've really been neglecting for a long time because our focus has been on other things, particularly deploying renewables.
That's really interesting. I want to read a statistic I read in Nature Sustainability in February. I mean, the fires have become so destabilized out west over the past century that in February, this group reported that California needs to burn 20 million acres, which is like the size of Maine, to restabilize the fires in the state. I mean, is that even, it sounds unthinkable to me. Is that even possible? Can we get there? Is that a real solution?
It is possible. It's going to require a significant increase in the workforce. There was some controversy earlier about whether we should be employing prisoners to do this work. That debate appears to have ended. Now everybody's kind of fine with that. We know we need more people doing that work. It hasn't really been a question of money. There was a group of more radical environmentalists that opposed any mechanical thinning of the forests, which is nuts because it's just not pragmatic. Traditionally, there's been a left-right difference here where conservatives have advocated more clear-cut logging of forests, in part for financial reasons. It's expensive to thin forests. It's cheaper to just log the whole things, and the reason is then you get the bigger trees that can be sold for timber. But even that debate appears to have gone away. I mean, what I object to is the politicization of this issue. There is now basically a broad consensus that we need some mix of selective thinning and mechanical harvesting along with prescribed burns. There's still, I'm sure, some differences in some local regions, but there's broad agreement among both Republicans and Democrats that we need to do that. And in fact, in early August, President Trump and Governor Newsom signed an agreement to significantly expand the amount of forests in California, both on public lands and private lands, that need to be better managed. So I think that this effort to sort of make all these fires about climate change, which I see as a manipulation because so many people think that fires are bad in forests, that it's actually preyed on people's ignorance. And I think it's also preyed on the availability heuristic, which is just that you hear so much about climate change. So when something seemingly abnormal occurs, people ascribe it to climate change. And I think it's just been disempowering because it's given people the sense that until we deal with climate change and supposedly, in some ways that supposedly we're not already, then we're going to be doomed to having these catastrophic fires. And that's obviously not true. Well-managed forests survive the mega fires and the high intensity fires. Not only that, but some of the rhetoric I just have to object to. I mean, everybody knows that there is a delay of several decades between when the carbon emissions go into the atmosphere and when you experience the warming. So the idea that somehow inaction on climate change or action on climate change is going to result in some change in temperatures is just totally ridiculous. We need to be taking action now. And I think the other thing is that, of course, the other misleading part of this is this idea that we're not doing anything on climate change. We're doing a ton on climate change. US carbon emissions peaked 13 years ago. Carbon emissions declined 2% last year. Overall in the US economy, they declined 10% from electricity. In fact, the emissions are lower now under Trump than they were under Obama. To be fair, that's not because Trump has really focused on it or done much about it, but it's because of this just long-term trend moving away from coal to natural gas thanks to fracking. So what I object to is sort of this politicization of the fires, this politicization of climate change. We're a country right now that I think needs fewer things to be divided over, not more.
There are some pretty compelling forces in play though right now, making these fires seem that climate change is the primary culprit in causing them. I mean, we're living in a world today that these scientists in the mainstream media have been warning for decades, where we're in the middle of a global health pandemic that's already killed almost 2 million people worldwide, almost 200,000 people in the US alone. We've got hurricanes slamming into the southeast United States. Australia just went through an excruciating fire season. And now the Western United States is on fire itself. So what do you think, how do we kind of combat that narrative? And what do you think has contributed to this?
Well, honestly, I think that conservatives and Republicans are the ones who really have the power to change the conversation on this. For a long time, many on the right have completely denied that the planet is warming or denied that humans are contributing to that warming. I think that it's time to move beyond that. I think once Republicans and conservatives have a positive, proactive environmental agenda that starts with questions of land use, which are primary around the world, but includes climate change, that embraces natural gas, that embraces nuclear power, I think it will force the radical left to change its rhetoric, or at least force Democrats to stop being so beholden to the radical left and its insistence on 100% renewables, which is nuts and would be terrible for the natural environment. So I think it's really incumbent upon Republicans. In fact, I wrote Apocalypse Never, my new book, in part for my Republican friends. I'm a moderate Democrat, full disclosure, so I admit I'm giving advice to a different party. But nonetheless, I think that we should all acknowledge climate change is real. It does pose some risks that are significant. It's not our biggest problem. It's certainly not our biggest environmental problem, but nonetheless, it's a problem we should approach and deal with. And it's going to be best dealt with by using our best available alternatives to fossil fuels and to coal, which are natural gas and nuclear power. I think the other thing that Republicans have been more sensitive to is the national security importance of nuclear energy. For me, when people say, why do you support nuclear? Obviously, there's environmental and climate change reasons. It takes about 400 times more land to generate the same amount of electricity from solar and wind projects than it does from a natural gas or a nuclear plant. So just on the land use alone, nuclear is the way to go. But I think the other thing to realize is that the main use of nuclear energy for the last 75 years has been to make nuclear weapons. And the United States has always understood that we needed to be involved in nuclear energy around the world, particularly among our allies, so that we could prevent nuclear weapons from spreading too quickly or falling into the wrong hands. And so that commitment to nuclear energy has obviously waned significantly. And so now we've seen that the Chinese are helping the Saudis to build a uranium enrichment project. I don't know a single national security expert on left, right, or center that thinks it's a good idea to let our longstanding ally, Saudi Arabia, work with the Chinese. It means that the Chinese are set to get the contract to build Saudi Arabia's nuclear power plants. The line between, I always point out, the line between soft power and hard power runs directly through nuclear energy. On the one hand, you have nuclear power plants, which cost somewhere between $10 and $20 billion to build. And the Chinese, when they build nuclear power plants, they're happy to throw in a football stadium, a highway, a sanitation system. And so it's soft power, and the Chinese are really prioritizing soft power. But on the other side is hard power, the potential to be able to build a weapon. So for me, I think we need to be getting back in the nuclear energy game. It's been declining in the West, not just in the United States, but also in France, Korea, Japan for the last several decades. The first imperative is national security, but by committing ourselves to nuclear energy, we are also then dealing with climate change, air pollution, and also reducing humankind's negative environmental footprint on landscapes.
But in the meantime, just tying it back to these fires, climate change has kind of became a really convenient excuse for a lot of these politicians who did nothing really to reinstate responsible land management and letting these wildfires just rage across the Western United States. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, it's now our irresponsible management has now made it harder to fight these fires, because ever since the 1960s, we've been stripping out roads of these forests. So you have a fire in the middle of the forest, but there's no roads to get to put a fire truck in there and spray down the water. So now you have to use these giant 747s to fly over the forest to dump water on them. So if I'm not mistaken, it's now making it harder to even fight these fires.
For sure, that's definitely one of the factors. And you know, like I said, I think there's a lot of different things that have resulted in the forest being badly managed. Clearly, it's been driven by ideology. We've prioritized climate change and renewable energy before responsible land management. On the roads issues, you know, as a conservationist, I'm sympathetic to wanting to have fewer roads and forests. But if you're going to do that, then you need to be committed to good forest management. And that's going to cost money. I actually think that because of this monomaniacal focus on climate change, we've lost sight of our commitment to conservation. The environmental movement used to be focused on land use. Now we're totally focused on greenhouse gas emissions. And so, you know, we have the possibility, because the amount of wood that we use and that we require has declined significantly, thanks in part to iPhones. I mean, I think we'll look back at newspapers, physical newspapers, as a kind of barbarity now that we have all of our newspapers digitally. I mean, just think about how much less paper we use today than we did 10 years ago. That creates an opportunity to be able to turn many of those production forests that we use for commercial purposes, into places that can be used for conservation, tourism, hunting, fishing, all sorts of other recreational activities. I mean, the fact of the matter is there's a number of economically depressed communities in California that have really been left behind as we've reduced the amount of wood that we've used for commercial purposes, wood, pulp, and paper. Those communities would really benefit from a recommitment, I think, to conservation, to even rewilding, as it's known, bringing back some of those endangered species. But we don't hear any of that from our political leaders. Instead, it's this just manipulative and quite ugly discourse about climate apocalypse, which we know is just grossly exaggerated. It's grossly overstated. Again, climate change is real, but this monomaniacal focus, I don't know what other word to use, this obsession with it has meant that we've neglected the health of our forests and really missed an opportunity for conservation as well.
Which of course ties into emissions, because even though we're so laser focused on emissions, right, these wildfires that now erupted out of our irresponsible land management policies have all but, erased all of California's progress under the cap and trade emissions program. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, they certainly produce a lot of carbon emissions when forests burn, but I think the thing you have to remember is then those carbon emissions will over time be reabsorbed by new plant growth. And so for that reason, you know, every time there's a big fire like this, there's always headlines about how there's significantly more emissions that we produce than from power plants and cars, and that's true, but you know, there is going to be vegetative regrowth, so those emissions will be reabsorbed by landscapes. Unless, of course, you convert those landscapes into parking lots, you know, or cities or farms or something where there's not equivalent amounts of vegetation being regrown. But you're spot on in the point about, in fact, that language has been used a lot. We're going to be laser focused on climate change. Well, when you're laser focused on climate change, it means that you're not properly focused on good forest management. And that's what's been neglected. I mean, I found it disappointing and even appalling the extent to which Governor Newsom, you know, really made this about climate change. And even the New York Times, I saw Peter Baker on MSNBC, he was interviewed, and they sort of do this thing, they go, well, everybody knows, of course, we have to deal with wood fuel buildup, but this is really about climate change. It's like, come on, you know, climate change is neither a necessary nor sufficient condition for these forest fires, whereas the accumulation of wood fuel is. And I think that distinction is essential to giving us some hope that we can actually restore our forests in ways that benefit communities and also, I think, contribute to the conservation vision that is really truly bipartisan. I mean, I think we forget that the Endangered Species Act, that conservation are broadly popular among both Democrats and Republicans, whereas this climate apocalypse discourse is just massively alienating and polarizing. It just drives us apart rather than together. And you could even see it when the governor met with President Trump. Here they were, if you watch the whole press conference, the first part of it, here they are just totally agreeing on the accumulation of wood fuel and talking about how they're working together. Trump said, and Gavin said, I think we need to do more of it. And President Trump said, oh, I agree, we should be doing much more of this, of the clearing of the wood fuels. Just, it was like a bro fest, you know, and a love fest between these two guys. And then Gavin kind of, for political kind, goes, well, now I have to talk about climate change. And then Trump's like, well, I don't really know if the world is warming. And it just kind of fell apart and just became kind of silly and dumb. So, you know, there is a way in which climate change just makes us all stupid. And I think you could see that in that press conference.
So Michael, just to wrap up, what does responsible land management look like to you? What are some recommendations that you have?
I mean, the first thing is it's got to come from the top. You got to have the governor of the state committed to this. That means he's got to just stop being so monomaniacal, so political about emphasizing climate change at every turn. And really, I think, bring us back to understanding what it means to be good stewards of the land. That means talking about it. That means spending more time out there. There's so much good publicity for the governor. It's crazy. I mean, the role of Native Americans is so important here. We treated our Native American tribes so badly. You know, the governor literally, previous California governors in the 19th centuries, you know, ordered the killing of Native Americans. It's a terrible part of our legacy. Here we have a chance to sort of not necessarily redeem ourselves, but certainly learn from some of that important wisdom and work with Native American tribes to borrow some of their techniques. You know, and I think that clearly massive civil service reform is required. I mean, this is scandalous that this whole city burned down and 10 people were killed, even though the town had asked 2 years previously 2 state regulators to be able to thin the forests. And those state regulators sat on that request. I mean, I don't understand how something like that happens. That should have been a high priority. That should have been made urgent. That's why you need the governor pushing down on it. But instead of doing that, he was busy suing the federal government, going on MSNBC, going around and sort of, you know, swaggering about how powerful California is. And I'll tell you one other thing that was just appalling was after I made some of these criticisms on Twitter and elsewhere, there were some journalists, by the way, who were defending the governor saying, oh, well, most of the land that's burning up in California isn't state land. Give me a break. I mean, on what other issue does California sort of go, oh, yeah, well, we don't have any control over? I mean, California, we act like the nation state we believe ourselves to be. I mean, we're the biggest, most powerful state, the 5th largest economy. If we don't like the federal government's fuel economy standards for vehicles, we go and make our own. I mean, we basically govern as though we are our own separate nation. And so then when it comes to forests, it's all learned helplessness. So obviously we've got to start taking responsibility. I mean, I think that's the theme here. Californians, we love our freedom just like all Americans do. It's, you know, we're here, we love the natural environment, we love our freedom, but freedom requires great responsibility. It requires both individual responsibility, but it also requires some amount of social responsibility. We're not seeing that. We're still dealing with the legacy of the 60s and its rejection, its radical libertarianism, its rejection of basic social norms, basic forms of individual and social responsibility. We see it with this mental health and drug addiction crisis on our streets. We see it with the open air drug markets that exist that have been a plague to poor communities in San Francisco and Los Angeles for decades. We now see top celebrities and others. We see Joe Rogan, Ben Shapiro, and others leaving California. Whatever you think of their politics, you don't want your most successful media figures and people that operate businesses that employ hundreds of people leaving the state, mostly because of the homeless crisis. So for me, I look at this catastrophic handling of our forests as just part and parcel of our catastrophic handling of so many other things, including how to deal with drug addiction, mental illness, our educational system. I mean, the state is really a disaster. It's being badly governed because our governors have always had pretensions to be president. They really imagine themselves to be global leaders. And I think they just need to focus much more on the basics and get back to doing what's right for the people of California as opposed to for themselves.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. Michael, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Tristan. It was a real pleasure.